it is time for our next panel, our afternoon plenary session, advancing legislation to address discriminatory practices. And so while you're filling that, I want to invite Chad Dion Lassiter, the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, and moderator of this next panel, to step up.
Thank you so much, Robin. It's good to see you. Good to see you too, Jem. And good afternoon to all of our friends and all of our colleagues. I'm really excited about this panel that we're getting ready to embark upon, entitled Advancing Legislation to Address Discriminatory Practices. For the time that we have been allotted, we will have an in-depth discussion on the compelling contemporary issues of voting rights, reinventing and/or reimagining law enforcement, and domestic terrorism. The latter part, we certainly need not just hope, but legislation, and we really need to have a frank conversation about domestic terrorism. Not terrorism that's foreign, not terrorism that's in a far off place, but terrorism that's germane to American democracy. As Robin shared with you, I'm Chad Dion Lassiter, the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, but I'm also just a servant of humanity and very humbled and honored to be leading the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. I'm joined today by the Honorable Robin Kelly, who is the U.S. House Rep, 2nd District of Illinois. We want to welcome Robin into our panel. Good afternoon, Congressman Kelly. Welcome. We also are joined by Leon Russell, Chairman of the Board for the NAACP, a civil rights and human rights expert for a considerable period of time. Mr. Russell was once the former IAOHRA president. So I want to bring greetings to you by a mutual colleague, Mr. Russell, who's David Emmanuel Gottlieb. Dr. Gottlieb wanted me to tell you hello. He's one of my dearest colleagues. And then our other mutual colleague, Ben Jealous, who's a professor at Penn, he says good afternoon to you as well. And last and certainly not least, a woman who's been on the front lines with regards to civil rights and human rights for a considerable period of time. And we're just happy that she was able to join us on this panel. I met her 4 years ago at an EEOC conference in San Antonio. The splendid and wonderful Beverly Watts, who's the Executive Director of the Tennessee Human Rights Commission. Good afternoon, Beverly. How are you? I think you're on mute.
Good afternoon, Chad. All of this mute and unmute stuff, I get it wrong.
But it's good to see you nonetheless.
Good to see you.
Before we jump into our panel discussion, I wanted to open up with a W.E.B. Du Bois quote coming out of the Du Boisian tradition. Du Bois articulated that either the United States will destroy ignorance or ignorance will destroy the United States. The second thing I wanted to do, as we're talking about hope, there's a great book entitled Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress, the Substance of Hope. That's a book we'll put in the chat for everyone. Once again, that's Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress, the Substance of Hope. And that's by William Jelani Cobb. He's a professor at Columbia University. Jem, is Congresswoman Kelly with us? Oh, Congresswoman Kelly, thank you for joining us.
There she is. Hey, Robin, long time no see.
Take yourself off of mute.
Oh my God, I'm like, oh my God.
Robin and I go way back.
Jim, and I don't know if Leon remembers me. Oh my God.
Oh yes, absolutely.
How are you?
It's all good. It's good to see everyone.
Definitely.
Great. So given the context that you all know one another, there should be a lot of pragmatic and a lot of intellectual and practical advice synergy. So let's get started. We're happy to have you, Congresswoman Kelly. We're going to start off with you. And your first moderated question is, give some concrete examples of voter suppression in the 21st century, and how have you sought to address these?
Well, things that I can think of to share are decreasing places where people can go vote. So there's less precincts for people to go to, which results in longer lines. If you've seen on television in some places like Georgia, how long people had to vote. Those are the two things that really stand out in my mind, but also changing, when people can register to vote and those kind of things. So And what was your other question?
And just concrete examples and how you've attempted to address them through legislation in your role.
Well, we already passed in the House the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, but have not been able to get that passed in the Senate. But we did, the Congressional Black Caucus is not giving up, as well as other folks too. We just held a vigil last night to remind the Senate that we are waiting and we expect things to get done. And actually today we had a meeting with Chuck Schumer and Dick Durbin about moving the Senate along. Unfortunately, because I had another meeting, I couldn't stay the whole time, but we have not, this is very important to us. We all served with John, and we want to make sure that this vote goes through. And there's other voting too, to take dark money out of politics and things like that, to make it easier for good government people to run.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm coming to Leon Russell next. We've often heard that the right to vote, specifically for Black people, is a sacred thing. Why has our democracy continued to struggle with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 as it relates to ongoing forms of discrimination when it comes to voting?
Well, the answer is complex on one level and simple on the other. The simple level is that racism has not died in the United States of America, and that there are people who believe that other people are less than and have rights that are less than and should not be doing things that constitute full citizenship. So that on the one hand, just pure out and out racism explains where we are. The why, I think, may be considered a little bit more complex, but it's all about power. It's about the power to control what other people do. And very clearly, since the beginning, the founding of this nation, it was clear that running the government, the power to be the ability to govern the nation, was the most powerful situation that there was. And we began with a constitution that restricted that ability to white male property owners. It's been a fight ever since the beginning to extend that right to other people, because people don't want to share power, period. And so you get the confluence of the thirst for power with racism, and you have what we have today. And I want to go back, Chad, to that quote that you lifted up at the beginning of the presentation. Yes, ignorance is about to destroy our democracy. And so it's incumbent on all of us, and let me state I served as IAOHRA president 2 terms, so I understand that you are government entities and therefore not engaged in partisan political activity. But I assure you that there is a need to educate, to eliminate the ignorance that is supporting the destruction of our democracy today.
Wow, wow. And I'm glad that you framed it out that way, because I think oftentimes in the role that I've been at PHRC for 3 years and 6 months, there's a lot of naysayers that are saying we shouldn't be in a space addressing white nationalism. You know, that we need to be very mindful of what we say. We need to be very mindful of what we do. And as I come to Beverly, when we look at Charlottesville and its context, that was not the historical images that Leon just spoke about. When we looked at Charlottesville, those individuals, they could easily have been, and they are, our pediatricians, our doctors, our lawyers, our judges, our Sunday school teachers. And so Beverly, could you frame out Charlottesville, white nationalism, and the January 6th insurrection? And I know that's threefold, but I think that it's very important for us to look at all 3 of these, because that's how we get where we're at now with the ginning up affairs as it relates to critical race theory, the redistricting, and things of that nature. So if you could frame out in your way and take your time with it, we're scheduled to, I think, 3:45, I believe, 3:40. Yeah, if you could just frame out Charlottesville, white nationalism, and the January 6th insurrection.
All right, let me start a little bit earlier than those. Since I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, I sit some 65 or 70 miles from the birthplace of the Ku Klux Klan. And just 2 weeks ago, we moved Nathan Bedford Forrest, the first Grand Dragon, from the state capitol to the State Museum. I never believe in killing history, because if you kill history, you'll forget it and you're subject to repeat it. So that's the other thing. And then just yesterday, some private citizen decided to put up a statue on I-65 South between Nashville and Franklin, and it could be seen from the expressway. Well, they finally put up bushes. That came down yesterday. So every once in a while, there's good things happening in terms of what the reminders are of those folks. And by the way, Nathan Bedford Forrest was a murderer, because he murdered soldiers at Fort Pillow in Nashville, Tennessee. We need to understand this history. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Let me jump to Charlottesville. But Charlottesville was about these memorials. That's why I bring it up. Most people said, well, Charlottesville, Heather Heyer died. Yeah, but what was it about? It was about the statue of Robert E. Lee and it coming down in Charlottesville. We have to understand that people did not start this after. They didn't put up these statues after the Civil War. They put them up in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. This was sort of like, no, we're going to go back because we don't like it. Hey, you soldiers have gotten out of World War II and they gave you some rights that we didn't think you did, even though you died for us and other stuff. So let's put up these statues honoring our war heroes. That's the first thing. So when we contextualize Charlottesville, we have to contextualize what it was. It also reinvigorated, and I don't use the word white nationalism, I use the word white supremacy. It reinvigorated white supremacy. White nationalism says something else to me. That's a little bit more sanitized, and we should never sanitize this stuff. Okay, so that's a problem I have when you use the word nationalism. White supremacy is a real different issue. It takes me to January 6th, when the highest land of the office was, in fact, in my opinion, bordering on sedition. Last time I looked, some folks went to jail for that. Nobody's gone yet. We thank Congress for their activities looking into it to really find out what's going on, because that's an important issue. And as a voting citizen, I thank them for doing that. Voter suppression laws are very interesting because they just didn't start after the last election. They started before, when they talked about voter registration. You could not give people water who's standing out trying to vote. That would be a violation. In Tennessee, there was a law, but the NAACP charged to the courts and managed to do a little around that and do some shaking of the trees. But those are the kind of things when we talk about voter suppression that we need to understand what it looks like. It is what Robin says, but it also is what happens when I go and I start to register people in front of the Kroger or in front of the Publix, and what that means. And if there are signatures that don't match in Tennessee, you could be charged with a crime. So, but those are the kind of things that really get to the heart, because who's going to now want to register people and other things, which means that you have an uninformed electorate who is not registered, which means you have no impact. A plus B equals C. Currently, throughout legislatures across this country, and I heard yesterday, Texas is getting 2 more seats, folks, because they were the fastest growing state in the country. Legislatures are redrawing these maps, and in districts across the country, they may not look like we want them to look. In Nashville, there's quite a bit going on. I am peripherally involved. See, every once in a while, you don't have to be directly involved. You can be peripheral. And we have to understand peripheral and directness. And directness is not always what happens. As we don't have authority to do voter suppression issues. We can't do white supremacy issues per se unless they're a landlord or an employer or a provider of public accommodations doing those kind of things. So we have to realize what it is. What do we have? But what do we have? We have partners. So those are the kind of things that I see. And those, I think, are the big issues that I see around what you raised, Chad. But finally, I would say, one of the things, and I think I heard Leon talk about that, was partnerships. Every once in a while, I too was an IAOHRA president for 2 terms. So I understand the nature of being in public service, but I also understand the nature of working with folks on a variety of issues, whether it's labor, whether it's others. I even work with the chamber. Somebody just unmuted this feedback. There you go, Stacy. I saw you. At some point, working with groups, I even work with chambers. Every once in a while, even if we disagree, we have to know who's in place, doing what, and what they're saying, and how they disagree with us before we're able then to identify ways to do that. But I'll just stop there and talk a little bit more about some of the examples going on here in Nashville that I think may be of interest to some people.
Yeah, certainly. I want to stay with you for a follow-up question, Beverly, and then I'll go to Leon and then Congresswoman Kelly. In Philadelphia, the Black church is an essential beacon as it relates to not just voter registration, but also voter education and combating voter suppression. There's a movement with regards to the concept around souls to the polls and how people want to use the souls to the polls, which is getting people from the Black church and other houses of faith to vote en masse. Do you see that trend in Tennessee as well with regards to the attacks on the souls to the polls?
Souls to the Polls has been around as long as I can remember. It's a great program. We need as many folk doing as much as we can wherever they can to marshal and get people out to register and then vote. And then where we see these challenges, whether they are challenges to people who have been incarcerated and expungement issues and making sure we can get expunged and people can then vote once they do. We just need to do everything we can. The key is the numbers. You can't win elections if you don't have the numbers.
Great, thank you.
Just on that last, on souls to the polls, I want to lift up this caution for folks to be on the lookout for legislation that changes voting dates, and specifically that moves early voting dates to end on the Saturday or the Friday before, which tends to restrict the opportunities for souls to the polls, because that last Sunday before the election is a big souls to the polls day. So you need to look at tactics as you look at efforts to restrict the vote.
Thank you for adding that additional social justice caveat. Leon, staying with you, can you please speak to how the NAACP has led in the space of addressing state-sanctioned violence, white supremacy, and voter suppression over the past year?
Oh my God. We have 2,200 units across the country. And if you look at the issues that have impacted our communities, and you talk about the last year, but whether it's police killings, whether it's the impact of COVID, whatever is going on, it is our units, NAACP units across the country that have had to step up with the assistance of the ACLU, with the assistance of willing congresspersons, with the assistance of other groups, the Legal Defense Fund and the National Action Networks. It has required all of us to step up and come together to deal with all of these issues. They are so massive when you consider what's going on. It never seems to end, whether it's police issues, whether it's issues that you were discussing before, the water issues. Water is the key to life, and safe water is a major issue. You got to deal with that while police are killing your children, while COVID is killing everybody who is unvaccinated. These are all major issues that require us to work in partnership, to work collaboratively. When Congresswoman Kelly is dealing with issues, lifting up issues before the country, we have to be there holding her back. We have to be there saying, this is right. This is what she needs to do. We have to be there in support of what's going on. We have to do that at the community level. That's local support. Telling your congressperson to support what Robin has put on the table. Telling your senator, and we've got to raise more hell with our Senate colleagues. I mean, I'm just putting it out there.
Yeah, certainly.
We have got to raise our voices about the need for the Senate to act, whether it's on voting rights, whether it's all across the board. Fixing the Voting Rights Act is a major imperative at this point. The freedom to vote, we've got to deal with those issues. I know we need to get the infrastructure stuff done, but the filibuster is going to kill us. We might as well recognize it, and we need to be telling our senators all of that. Now, what does that mean for human rights agencies? It means that you all who can't do the political stuff need to be talking and educating your community organizations, working with your community organization so that they understand the impact of all of these things, and so that they do the legwork of getting the messages to their lawmakers about the changes that need to be made.
Thank you so much. Congresswoman Kelly, civility seems to be missing in Washington, and that's really an understatement. But civility seems to be missing in Washington with regards to discussions around Black Lives Matter, law enforcement, and domestic terrorism. The first part of this question is, why is that? And then the second part is, how have you talked about the aforementioned to your constituents and your colleagues?
I know people don't believe this, but if you ask some Republicans, they would say the same thing, that we get along better than people think at the end of the day. There's a lot of bipartisan bills that go out, and we do work together a lot. But I think for people, for their constituents, it's like they play this role, you know, and frankly, and I'm trying to be as nonpartisan as possible, but from the last administration, a lot of permission, you know, was given to act in certain ways. But when you think about some of the people that were elected to Congress this last time, I mean, it's scary. Some of the people that are here, you know, that don't wear masks, want to bring their guns to the floor, said that January 6th was just a regular tourism day. You know, that's not everybody, you know, saying they would kill, you know, another colleague. And on January 6th, I was one of the last people out. I was one of those on my hands and knees, you know, that you saw on the news. So it's not everybody, but the people that it's not, it feels like they're afraid to speak up, that because the last administration, it really gave permission to those, to me, that have been holding it in, to let it hang out. And some of my colleagues, but also the public, because it's the public allowing some of these people, you know, to be elected. And there's some people elected on my side of the aisle. I don't agree with everything that they say either, you know, but there is, to your point, a decorum. I mean, we, you know, represent the people in nation's capital. There is a decorum that we need to show, and a level, you know, of respect. But I just think permission, you know, definitely from the last time, that ways that people have always felt, they just feel freer to show it now. And even those that don't think it's right, you know, they don't really speak up like they should.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Congresswoman Kelly, for, you know, letting us know that there are a lot of misconceptions, and for us not to always buy into the media narrative. I want to stay with you and just ask, because you're in it, you know, I think oftentimes we try to frame things out as an either or, when really it's both and.
Mm-hmm.
We need civil rights, human rights folk. That's the both. And then the and is, we need folk who have come out of the tradition that you've come out of, who are on the policy side, on the legislation side, that will push policies, sort of like, not sort of like, but similar to what the NAACP Defense Fund does, right? Policy is what we really need to be looking at. How do we weed out domestic terrorists that make up law enforcement? And I just want to say, for those of us who are on this virtual, you may say, there are domestic terrorists who are in law enforcement. Yes, they are. The FBI has qualitative and quantitative data. Most of us know that, right? But it's okay if this is the first time that you've heard it. But how do we weed out domestic terrorists that make up law enforcement? And then how do we reinvent law enforcement for Black and brown people beyond the suspicion and surveillance of an occupying force? And just as a caveat, I'm not saying that all law enforcement are looking at Black and brown people
No,
from
I
a
got
suspicion. Okay, I just, because, in these roles, we got to be very careful as well, right?
I mean, I come from a law enforcement family. I'm from New York, so I have a lot of NYPD, and 2 of my nephews belong to the Chicago Police Department. But that doesn't negate what's right is right and what's wrong is wrong.
Certainly.
And it's interesting because I just had a meeting with a lot of my police chiefs, and my area is urban, suburban, and rural. And I'm gonna tell you, they are having a hard time recruiting people to even want to be police. And they're definitely having a hard time recruiting people of color, period. They don't want to be associated. And I think we've talked about this a lot, like, what is the evaluation system when you are hiring law enforcement? How much vetting is really done? When you think about what happened in Cleveland, the 12-year-old that was killed, in that policeman's record, it said that he lost his job at another police department, and then he was rehired, when in his record, he should not have been, rehired. And I just think a better job needs to be done as far as evaluation. Who are we using as references? Who are they using as references? I'm not a psychologist, but what steps can we put people through to see, what they're thinking? What situations can we put with all the technology now? What can we put together situations that people can enact? I did it in when I went to a tech conference where I was a social worker and had to make a decision, about a scene, taking a child out of the home and leaving them in, just situations like that. And really following, if we do hire somebody, the probationary period and how they're really doing, or even after the probationary period, not making it, I'm not saying fire people right away, but it just seems like people can have a lot of infractions and then still, keep their job. But I just think, and I'm not saying I have the answer, but what is the vetting? What is the evaluation process? What have people done before? What groups have they belonged to? Those kind of things, because I've heard that too. In fact, someone just told me in Chicago that, people sometimes don't even want to call anonymously because they don't trust the police officer that they're calling, that they won't go back to the gangs and say this person called, and told on you, and then that person finds themselves, in trouble. And but I know the police departments are suffering, trying to find people, and especially trying to find officers of color, people of color that want to be officers. It's a scary situation. When I think about, I said I came from a police family, but my own son, who's the same family, and when he gave some of his choice words about police officers, and I had to remind him, well, your uncles, your cousin, he said, I don't care, because of the amount of times that he was stopped and what he was accused of. And I just brought him home from college, and I had a knock on the door telling me he was in a gang, and he had just been home from college in a whole nother state for 2 hours, and these are people that knew me that said that to me. So it is a big problem, but we have to find solutions, or there'll be even more George Floyds, and on and on and on and on, which is another bill that we're trying to pass.
Absolutely.
And can't get it through the Senate. We really need the public to put the pressure on the Senate, and then put pressure on Democrats and Republicans. Anybody that lives in West Virginia or Arizona, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman. And Leon, why don't you chime in, and also Beverly?
I want to go back to.
You know what, Leon, before, I'm gonna have to excuse myself. I have to run. We're gonna be voting soon. So good to see you guys again.
Thanks, Robin.
Thank
Okay,
you so
take
much,
care.
Congresswoman.
Bye-bye.
I think we need to think about, we want to narrow it down to cinema and mansion. But some of us live in places where there are other senators with D's in front of their names who need to be talked to as well. So I just want to make sure that we're talking to everyone when we talk about these bills. The filibuster is literally killing us, and we need to address it.
Thank you so much. Beverly, this is your time now to share with us some of the things that your commission has done to address voter suppression, domestic terrorism, state-sanctioned violence, but it's not limited. Go wherever you want to go. You could talk about fair housing violations. Just while we have this time, let's talk about some of the unique and innovative things that the Tennessee Human Relations Commission is working on under your leadership. And that of
All right, and I keep telling people, we're the Human Rights Commission. Nashville is the Human Relations Commission.
Sorry, human rights. I stand corrected.
It doesn't matter, but people always get us confused when we're in the same space and place. Number one, and I think I said this earlier, voter suppression issues in and of themselves are not direct issues that we can work on under our law. So that's the first thing we have to understand. What can you do under your law? But who can you partner with who's doing these things, and how can you support them? That's really what we do and what I've done most of my career. So every once in a while, we have to understand where we are, who we are, and what our confinements and other things are, and use those collectively. I've been working with the Urban League of Middle Tennessee, and they've been working on redistricting. Guess what? They've been, along with a group called the Equity Alliance, which is a group that started, 2 Black women, started it about 6 years ago. They are blazing trails across this state and organizing folks along with other organizations. The NAACP, where I am a life member, I continue to support as an individual and as an organization. I just did some training for the national folks on fair housing with Stella Adams and Floyd May, former executive at HUD. Strategic initiatives to voting issues are things I do. I sit at tables all the time where people are talking about what can we do to build community. Some of them are voting rights issues. Some of them are development issues. Some of them are gentrification and transportation issues, because this gets to the notion of where do we live and how do we get to jobs when they come. All of this stuff coming down the pike under the legislation, and money's coming into our communities. It's critical that those of us in the human rights field understand what's going to happen, when, where, and how. So I talk to council members. I talk to state legislators, those who will talk to me. I talk to anybody who will listen and find out what's going on. What do I know? I know that business people want to hire people and get them to work. People want them to have a safe place to live, because if they don't listen, they can't be good employees. So there's some issues that are not necessarily jurisdictional, but are developmental and foundational in terms of building community. Dr. King talked about the beloved community. The beloved community is not a march, folks. The beloved community is structures, systems, and things that favor the citizens. And it's building those so that people have access.
Yeah.
Access. The International Human Rights Day theme is reducing inequalities and advancing human rights. That's the international theme this year. That's something that can be done simply. Eleanor Roosevelt said, where does it start? It starts in communities where we live, in small places. These are not big items. Some of these are simple meetings. Another friend of mine is a Metro Council member at large, Zulfat Suara, first Nigerian Muslim woman to be elected to a citywide office here in Nashville, Tennessee. She did 2 things this past year, and I supported her in it. One was she named Fifth Avenue after John Lewis. It's called John Lewis Way now. It runs from Broadway to Jefferson Street. And she brought people across from all spectrums together. And we supported her on that, because guess what? A whole lot of people around the table don't necessarily know each other and wasn't talking. So she was able to do that. She also sponsored legislation on affordable housing. Why? Again, and wrote a report, a massive report. Somebody at Amazon read it. By the way, we're Amazon's logistics model. Now, I don't always agree with everybody, but when they do something good, I think we need to call their name and not just say they're bad.
Certainly.
And so Amazon is now doing affordable housing and transportation related initiatives in Nashville. They're logistics people. They move these packages. I guess they can probably move people too from job to job and get them there. So somewhere you look for where they're partners. That's what I see that's going on. Those are the kind of things that I'm involved in. I'm involved in a lot of organizations. I'm on the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, where I sit with bankers and talk with them about, and I'm talking with bankers and some of the largest banks in the country as a result of that. Wherever people can make, that's the national piece, but wherever we can make a difference, because when Renaissance Bank in Nashville said, would you serve on an advisory committee? I said, yes.
Yeah.
And I sat there and I brought people to the table who had expertise, not necessarily me, to talk to them about things they could do to enhance their fair lending practices in this community, not national. There's legislation and then there are local initiatives. There's a variety of things that we can do. And a lot of times it's a matter of what can I do to make this work? And then there's a thing called my job. And we try to do that as
Yeah.
effectively as possible. That's
Yeah.
investigating claims and issues. But the biggest piece there is helping people understand who we are and what we do and getting people to understand. And this, I say this all the time, please don't go in and curse out your manager because they're going to fire you. And you mitigate your claims with us.
Yeah.
You literally
Yeah.
step on them. So we do a lot of that and we work with folks. But I mean, those are some of the things that I see that's going on. But the one thing I want to just point out too is we got money from HUD to do, I think we did 7 or 8 fair housing seminars, and they're still on our website. And all of those, we look for people who are doing things that were not necessarily in our purview. I'm a member of the Tennessee Access to Justice Commission, which is a Tennessee Supreme Court Commission. And they use pro bono attorneys along with legal services to do eviction stuff. So we were talking about evictions last November.
Wow, you've mapped out a lot here, and you touched upon some themes that really resonate with me when we're talking about the beloved community as espoused by Martin Luther King, Rabbi Abraham Yeshua Heschel. It wasn't just a theoretical model; it's an everyday thing. And then King follows that up with, one of his seminal books, Chaos or Community.
Mm-hmm.
When Leon talked about the number of affiliates with the NAACP, when you mapped out all that you just spoke about, I want both of you to share with our virtual audience, how do you deal with racial trauma and racial fatigue? Because we do this work. My mentor, Dr. Cornell West, my very own pastor, Reverend James S. Hall Jr., who comes out of Marion, South Carolina, who baptized Jesse Jackson, oftentimes would always say to me, you just put your head down and you do it. But that's not good for this new generation of civil rights, human rights workers. A lot of us have training in sociology, social work, therapy. I have a brilliant senior leader in my Philadelphia regional office by the name of Renessa Edwards. Her and I just the other day were talking about how she's getting her master's in counseling at Eastern University. We're talking about at some point, maybe in 2023 for the PHRC, that we will have civil rights division, but also a counseling component to deal with the psychological challenges that people have when they're displaced because of housing, when they're discriminated against because of public accommodations and commercial property, so forth and so on. And so I'm very mindful that in this moment that we find ourselves in, the coronavirus pandemic, the virus of hate, the economic collapse, the economic pandemic. Could you, Leon, start us off, and Beverly, could you follow after that to just really briefly talk about how you deal with racial trauma, either in your agency, the NAACP, down where you are with the Human Rights Commission, or just personally, because it's real. And whereas though the former historical guard would just be like, hey, we just do it, we put, that's who we are, but my generation is more about processing and not over processing, but recognizing the moment that we're in could serve as, I'm looking at a clip of Derek Chauvin having his knee on George Floyd, and I might be traumatized because growing up in North Philadelphia, I was the victim of police brutality as well. So if you could speak to that, Leon.
I think you touch on a subject that we need to first just simply recognize that trauma in and of itself is a factor in all of our lives. And trauma is not restricted to our simple, the racial situation. Trauma impacts a child's ability to learn. And because you don't know what happened in a child's house before they came to school. You don't know the trauma that happens in a neighborhood. So the first thing is to recognize that trauma does in fact impact the quality of life, period. And that we have to, in recognizing it, begin to do things that address it. With our branches of the NAACP, quite frankly, I will tell you that from a policy standpoint, it was only a couple of years ago that we began to talk about trauma and the need to start dealing with trauma. So we haven't perfected that model, but I would say to my colleagues in human rights agencies across the country that one of the things that I think probably we've gotten away from to a degree, and many of them have slipped away, is that whole element of community relations where we talk to each other. We talk to each other about the problems in our communities, and we work as a commission, as an organization, to start to resolve those problems. It requires us to begin where I think we've talked all over this during the first part of this discussion. It requires us to understand that we don't have all of the solutions, and therefore we have to build coalition. We have to reach out and have partnerships. And that's why it's incumbent on us as community relations, human rights officials to reach out across our communities, to the religious community, to the education community, to the healthcare community, to the civil rights community, whatever that is in our community, and bring them all to the table to talk about what's negatively impacting our communities, what looks down the road to be negatively impacting us. When you talk about the issue of affordable housing, there is that whole issue of gentrification, but I would submit to you that climate change is going to further exacerbate the housing crisis and lead to greater housing discrimination across this nation. We need to be prepared to deal with that now. With the amount, Beverly, of investors who are taking over the housing market from individual buyers, are we on a pathway to another housing market crash that will further, again, exacerbate homelessness in this country? These are issues that we have to look at as human rights officials, and figure out where our role is in those situations. That discussion you were having about water in Los Angeles and water in Michigan, well, it's water all over the country. Hawaii is dealing with a situation where a naval fuel storage system has impacted the water on the whole island of Oahu. There are school districts that have lead pipes that are leaching lead every day of the year that are not being addressed because of the shortage of money. These are issues that lead to trauma, lead to negative situations in our communities that I believe our human rights organizations, our entities have an obligation to begin to address, because it's about public policy.
Thank you so much, Leon. And as we go to Beverly, just really briefly, one of the things that we did at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission is we brought in a person to do mindfulness and meditation for the entire staff. Not from a Zen perspective, but from a perspective of just dealing with the moment that some of us had to move from being people who are introverts to now being, self-confined to our homes because of COVID, not having that human interaction. Those of us who like to do diversity, equity, inclusion, and unconscious bias training in the moment now had to be relegated to virtual. And then once again, the vicarious traumatization of looking at some of the things that we saw with the unrest of George Floyd and multiple others. Most recently, I got triggered when I looked at Kyle Rittenhouse going through that fake occasion in the courtroom. We come to Beverly, and Beverly, if you could speak to racial trauma, forms of trauma, a message that we need to maybe share with some of our colleagues while we have them in this brave space around the importance of self-care for those of us who do this work.
Thank you, and I will ditto everything Leon has said. Really, it really is about understanding where you sit in your community, understanding what your role is on a day-to-day functioning basis as in your organizations. That's one. Number two is understanding what are the factors around us. That's the differences, the challenges, and the issues that confront us both internally and externally. COVID-19 gave us challenges I don't think any of us thought would have occurred. My first 6 months was almost a 24-hour. I was running completely 24 hours. I was on video calls. I was on a computer. I was doing this, that, and the other. And I was in my house. I couldn't get away from work, whatever that was. But the one thing that the Zoom calls gave me was the ability to be in touch. And it happened early on, be in touch with individuals outside my space. We weren't physically in touch, but we were in touch. And that was really a saving grace for me. It gave me sanity in the midst of chaos and confusion. And also the other thing was, even with the George Floyd issues and everything that transpired, there was the hope of all of the people who marched in favor of that. And I still see John Lewis standing on Black Lives Matter in front on, 15th or 16th Street in Washington, D.C., before he made his transition. See, that to me is the hope. I know Derek Chauvin had a knee on a neck, but I'm looking for where is the hope and where is the opportunity for me to move forward. If we think about domestic terrorism today, I've had a wonderful life and an interesting life, and I've always reached beyond my comfort zone. I've always liked to know a whole lot of people doing a whole lot of things. So I know about domestic violence as in women, and I've been involved for more than 30 years. So there is trauma that occurred in homes for women and children then. I worked in school systems in Chicago where gangs were prevalent. There was trauma in prevalent. I understand police and know them good, the bad, and the ugly because I've worked with Noble. So there's a lot of things that we can do in our roles because we have voice. But we can make that. Some people don't do it all. Some people do more than they should, probably me, but I keep doing it anyway because I can. So every once in a while we have to decide what is it that we can do. Again, it's not a march. It is an action and action activities that build community. Because if it's a march or an issue, fine. For counseling issues, I've been involved with the Black psychologists for about 40 years. I know those who are still around. I don't want to run a counseling service in my agency. That's me personally. I do want to have resources to do that. And so I'm talking with the care team for the healthcare people in the state of Tennessee to make sure that they have the services that our staff need, not just me. We're building team around collaboration and other things. We've been away from each other so long that I think my biggest challenge is going to be coming back into the office and rebuilding teams so people are congenial to each other, that they have on proper clothing, and that they speak in a language that's nice, because we haven't done that in a while. We can go to our corners, mute these screens, and yell and scream at these screens that we have in front. But we've got to get back in the habit of being back into this collaborative nature. So I'm struggling with some of those things. So when we fast forward to domestic terrorism, whether it's police, January 6th or whatever, some of those are the extremes. The question is, what can we do about those that aren't the extremes? That's the police departments and the chiefs of police, because if you're in a city and you don't know your chief of police, know them. You should be able to talk. You should be able to call the chief of police. I used to be able to call the state TBI director, but we got a new one. But I do know him. He was the chief of police in Knoxville. So I can call him directly. Somewhere along the way, we've got to have that capacity to say, hey, there's an issue I need to talk to you about, and they will take your call. That's
Great.
building relationships. That's the important piece. And then we
Mhm.
have to learn and we have to listen and learn from each other. It is a collaborative nature. It is not me, them, others. And most of the time, sometimes I'm just in a room listening
Yeah.
and hearing ideas and sharing them with others, because I think that's the important piece as well.
Being in the room is very important. Being in the room.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
We have two more questions, and then we're going to stop at 3:20 and then open it
Chad,
up for
Chad, if we could for a moment, I want to go back to what Beverly said about recognizing our own teams, and because quite frankly, the experience of staff not being in an office together, it's interesting. I am sitting in Baltimore, Maryland, as I speak to you, at an NAACP staff retreat. It's the first time the staff has been together in 2 years.
wow.
And the whole idea is what Beverly sort of went over. We need to figure out how we work together, how we collaborate, how we more efficiently do the job of being good human rights advocates, human rights enforcers, if you will. And part of that is the need to know each other and what our skills are, what our needs are, and being able to communicate those things with each other. And that's what we've been doing at the NAACP for the last 3 days.
No, I'm glad you added that. There seems to be a lot of warring factions. There are some people who fundamentally have thrived with levels of productivity working from home. There are others who have struggled. I know on the state level in Pennsylvania, there's a hybrid model. The PHRC, we're doing 3 days at home, 2 in the office. The majority of senior management, we're doing Monday through Friday in the office. There's also a philosophical belief for me that you cannot fight human rights and civil rights by the seat of your pants. But like Beverly stated, there have been some opportunities to utilize the greater enhancement of virtual meetings where you don't have to travel across the state of PA if you're in Philadelphia, or travel from Pittsburgh to Harrisburg. But I think that there has to be, to your point, Beverly, we as leaders have to listen. On a macro level, we have to be able to set policies, but be willing to listen on a meso and micro level. Because once again, I have a lot of folk in our agency who have just done some tremendous stuff with laser sharp focus from home. What I was going to say is that we're going to stop in 2 or 3 minutes and then open it up for Q&A. But I wanted to start with you, Leon, and then go to you, Beverly, with regards to the concept of hope. I think that when we use words like love, when we use words like hope, there are some individuals, not generalizing or stereotyping, don't see how powerful they were. But when we look at historically the civil rights movement, it was love. When we look at the civil rights movement historically, it was hope. And folk were not hoping pie in the sky. And some of them did not live to see the fulfillment of those things that they did. I think about those 4 young girls and the Sunday school class who died a superficial martyrdom death, but it served as a catalyst. And I think about so many other things. But when we talk about hope, for you, Leon, what does hope look like?
Hope looks like following the George Floyd incident or so many other incidents across the country, seeing a multi-ethnic response, seeing people coming out and talking about those situations, speaking about the tragedy, speaking about the need to reform those efforts, and seeing the rainbow that reflects. That's hope. It says that there are people out there. The other side of that, of course, is those who think there ought to be a better situation but never say anything about it. Dr. King talked about that, you know. there's the horror of those who commit terror, but there's also the horror of those who allow terror to be committed without saying a word. And I think we need to lift up those who speak out against those kinds of things when we see it. And we need to take hope from that, and we need to go out and join forces with those who are exhibiting that kind of action and work with them to change policy. That's hope for me.
Thank you. Hope for you, Beverly. What does hope look like for you?
I think it means the same as Leon. It also, hope transcends some of these visual barriers that we think exist between us, our age, our gender, our race. And when we get over that, I think we're able to do some things. I think, the one thing that Dr. King said, and I'm going to quote it directly, he said, the ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people,
Mm-hmm.
but the silence of the good people. Okay. And we've got to find the good people. That means we've got to be willing to engage in conversation across our differences and across our own biases. And if we don't have biases, bless you, because we do. We come in with our own biases, and we're going to have to be able to do that. Sometimes we're going to walk into rooms, and I've been doing this an awful long time. And unfortunately, I'm finding sometimes I'm still the only one in the room that look like me. But that's the nature of the beast. But I'm willing to do that and walk through, because that takes a little bit of courage to walk into those kind of rooms, okay? And to talk to folks and to talk to them eye level. As one of my friends says, George Manning, he's a longtime friend and professor and written a lot of books. Not eyes up or down, but eyes straight ahead, looking them and talking to them, even if we disagree. I loved what Congressman Kelly said, that a lot of them get along, and there's a lot of bipartisanship going on certain issues. But all we're hearing is this stuff about what's not happening. I think as human rights professionals, human relations professionals, community relations professionals, our role is to tell the story of where there's the good news.
Yep.
Yeah.
The good news of where things are happening in our community. That's something that highlights the good news. That, there are going to be bad stories, but what's the good news that came out of something that was bad? What's the good news that we're seeing coming out of our schools? What's the good news coming from the police department? What did the police chief do that makes good sense?
Yeah.
What did they do for training? How did they invite us in? Those are the stories, because when we start telling the good stories, people see the possibilities. If we keep telling the bad stories, the negative stories, we've got to fight the negatives. I'm not saying don't fight it, but we've got to also tell the good stories about what's happening so that people see, live, and feel the possibilities.
No, I like that, looking at things from a strengths-based perspective. And as we come to a close with our portion and open it up for Q&A, I'm reminded by the founder, or one of the founders of the NAACP, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. He wrote the book Souls of Black Folk. And in that book, he talked about the problem of the 20th century being the problem of the color line. The problem of the 21st century, all of us on this call should be able to reach consensus, is the problem of the color line. Du Bois, in fact, was talking about white supremacy. That's not an indictment against white individuals. And so as we go to our Q&A, starting with Leon, leave us with some advice, really briefly, leave us with some advice or a call of action with regards to what we should be doing to repair this diseased democracy, whether that's from a policy standpoint, whether that's just fundamentally, to Beverly's point, being a good person. At the PHRC, we have an annual, once a year, the Anti-Defamation League comes in and trains us. We got trained on critical race theory. We're getting trained on diversity, equity, inclusion, because to Beverly's point, for every context, there's a pretext. We all have biases. Give us a call of action, Leon, just really briefly, so that we can have some time for Q&A.
I think if I were to say to you, what should your agencies be doing? I would say, understand that public policy impacts everyone, but not equally. And that our responsibility is to ensure that public policy does not kill us, which means that we all have to become activists. We all have to recognize that we may not be out in the street marching, but we have an obligation to identify those things about public policy that are the result of racism, supremacist ideology, and the like, and begin to work together to change those things. That's how we perfect this union.
Thank you so much, Beverly. A call of action.
The call to action, and I'll just tack on to what Leon said. We also have to know what's being proposed. We have to know what pieces of legislation are being put into place by who. If we're in cities and counties, who's doing it? What does it say? And we have to be willing to speak out about it. I regularly write letters to legislators and others, especially if it's not equal, to make sure that they understand what the problems are. And I put it in writing. Sometimes I'll go testify if it's at the state level, if they'll let me. They don't always let me, but I find them in the hallways anyway. Okay. I go to city council. I talk to the mayor. I buttonhole folks everywhere. I was on an elevator with one of the mayors not about 3 years ago, and they said, "We're doing." I said, "Mr. Mayor, this is what you need to do and how you need to do it." And that right there is flawed. Didn't take me long to say it. I said, "I'm happy to work with you. Who do I need to call?" And I called him. But at some point, I think we just have to follow up and do that, because I think that's the answer. And some of it's simple, it's real close to us. Some of it's a little bit further out, but we just need to find allies and do what we can, internal and external, to our own organizations to help things move along. And then the other piece is, most of the time, I'm putting people together more than I'm doing work. Is being willing to put the parties together who have the answers and get out of the way so they can do something about it.
Wow. I want to thank you and Leon, and as well as Congressman Kelly and Congresswoman Kelly, excuse me, and Congressman Raskin wanted to attend but had some other work. As we go to our Q&A, I want to leave everyone with a quote from Theodore Parker that's oftentimes attributed to Dr. Martin Luther King. And it's okay to be attributed to Dr. Martin Luther King, but Theodore Parker said, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice." King said that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. I use that quote to simply say to all of us, no matter what our budgets are, no matter how dark the shadow of hate is, the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. May we continue to use resolve, resiliency, and our very souls to alleviate the suffering of folk on every side of the color line and gender line, and the universe will center us on the side of justice. Thank you for allowing me to moderate this panel today with three titans who've been a pillar in the human rights and civil rights community and various other communities. I turn it back over to Jim Stowe to organize this portion of the last 10 minutes of Q&A for those of you who have questions for our august body of individuals here on our panel.
Well, Chad, thank you. Well done to all of you, our colleagues. And I'm so glad we had a chance to let you know about Leon Russell having been president of this organization for 2 terms, and also Beverly Watts having also been one of our past presidents for 2 terms. And Robin Kelly also was a former director of a human rights organization as well. And so all these folks have taken these experiences and continue to be guardians of this work wherever they've gone. So thank you all for continuing to do what you do. So folks, questions, comments, anything that anybody wants to raise here, as we got about 10 minutes here. So any questions? I've got one there from Dante Bonner. Go ahead, Dante.
Good afternoon, everyone. Ms. Watts, Mr. Russell, it's good to see you all. It's been a long time since I've seen you all from the Florida Commission on Human Relations under Mr. Ron McElrath. So I grew up a little bit. I like your comment, Beverly, concerning about the wording that was used. You talked about white supremacy versus white nationalism. As an organization, how does one navigate to be able to effectively educate the public and businesses concerning about their rights and responsibilities? Because it seems as though in the climate that we're in, everyone is very sensitive to the type of words that are being used, white supremacy or white privilege or something along those lines. So then it begins to have a defensive wall. So as an agency trying to remain neutral, but still trying to make sure we're educating those the realities of what individuals and employees and also persons in the housing world trying to establish, how can we navigate that to be effective?
I think we start with the law that we have on our books. It's a pretty simple process. You start with the law, and then you're going to have to ask questions of folks if they keep throwing up the barriers, because always I remind people that we are responsible for enforcing the Tennessee Human Rights Act, which protects everyone based on race, color, national origin, etc. And I also remind them that many of the people we serve are a variety of ages, colors. They have disabilities, some don't have disabilities, some are LGBT, some are not. And it is really about community, it is about their employees, and it is really about family, friends, and the community. So a lot of this is not to take a defensive position, but to take a proactive position and a position of education, of outreach, and everything else. Because one of the things I think we run the risk, and I think, and I'm as guilty as anybody, we run the risk some days of going, oh, it's a cloudy day. Oh, it's cloudy, it's cloudy. But what we need to look at and say, oh, there's a bright spot. There's some sun peeking out. And then go back to our laws and put together good training programs that tells people what their responsibilities and what their rights are. And we've been doing that this last year virtually, and we've been doing a pretty good job. We're getting ready to now ramp this up to another level. Hopefully some of this will be in person, but to ramp it up to another level and then send this out and start, I want to have my staff start tweeting and putting this stuff on Facebook, because we have Facebook pages, but just so people can then link back to it. Why? Because they need to understand their rights and their responsibilities, the rights of citizens and the responsibilities of those who are employers, housing providers, and providers of public accommodations, and then not get into the argument, but get into why it's right, because it's the law. I use that now. I'm sorry, I will use that. It's good to see you, though. You have grown up a little bit.
One of the questions that's come up, I'm sorry, go ahead, Leon, please, go ahead.
I totally agree with Beverly. It's about enforcing the law and reminding people what the law is and teaching people. So yes.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions from the audience?
You have Diane raise your hand.
Diane, please.
Thank you so much for the discussion, Leon and Beverly. Just wanted to perhaps ask all of our participants, maybe a strategic plan of sorts or visioning sessions, just to talk about some of these ancillary issues that we don't necessarily have jurisdiction over, but just to, I guess, create a record and the perspective of the human rights agencies on these issues may be a resource for community organizations that take on these issues, and that we recognize these issues as important issues for our communities and our municipalities. I just wondered if anybody's doing that.
We're always doing that, Diane. We're now looking at our strategic plan and looking at our partners and just trying to do some work around that. And I think it's been going on in other communities. Maybe we need to do a mapping of who's doing what around IAOHRA. Every once in a while, we always know what we're doing individually, but collectively, I think we're much, much broader and much stronger, doing a lot more than we share with each other. I really do believe that, having worked in this organization for years. Leon and I would talk at least once a month when we were both working in the same space. Sometimes more than that when he was the president, because he called me for more jobs than I wanted to do. But what happened? I learned stuff. So I think that's great, and we just need to perhaps do that. I convened this group 25 years ago doing strategic planning. Somewhere there's an old plan out there that talks about some of this.
Last IAOHRA meeting I attended, we were talking strategic planning. So I think it's very important to get back to that. And I just the word share.
Right, that's it.
We need to understand that we should be sharing with each other. Jim, unfortunately, I am going to have to, they're
Yes, sir.
calling me to do some NAACP stuff.
Very good, sir.
Thank you so much.
Leon,
Leon.
thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you indeed. Take care of yourself. All the best.
And
Leon,
I want to jump in to say
take care. Thank you.
Leon. Thank you, Beverly. It's so great to see both of you. And I was going to ask a question, but I know, Leon, you got to jump. I just wanted to give my
Thanks, Robin.
thanks.
Thanks.
Jim, I just wanted to share, I think one of the things that would be really advantageous to Diane's question is that as a organization, we should be sharing newsletters with one another. We should be sharing annual reports with one another as much as we can. If we're able to share, I know that everyone can't share because some of the strategic plans are kind of confidential, but to really kind of like share best practices, right? So like PHRC, we're in the midst of getting ready to do a 5-year strategic plan. In the past, PHRC has always done a 3-year strategic plan, but I got the commissioners to agree on a 5-year strategic plan because I think it's really beneficial to expand it out to 5, that no matter who the executive director is, no matter who the director of fair housing commercial property is, so forth and so on. We've also implemented something called MOP, which is an acronym for a manual operations and procedures that in key positions, if someone leaves, you can pick up that MOP, open up that table of contents, and you still can run whoever that new person is as the hearing examiner, as the regional director in Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Philadelphia, as the executive director. I think oftentimes a lot of things die because we build them around personalities, i.e. people, when we should be building it around the mission. So at PHRC, we've done a redefinition of who we're here for. We're here for the people of the Commonwealth, and we're putting that in writing. And so when you look at it like that, it doesn't matter who your executive director is. It matters sometimes, but it doesn't matter who your RD is. It's your mission. And can you have a strategic plan that forecasts where you need to be in the 21st century? So I know that Jim and I, Robin and other colleagues, we have a follow-up call, but Jim and I have been talking about this over really the past 5 months, that we should look at having an IAOHRA quarterly newsletter that we can get some commitments from some of us who make up the membership to take the lead on submitting articles that can give a snapshot and an overview of what our particular organizations are doing. So I just wanted to add that to this discourse as well. And once again, thank you for having me as a moderator. Learned so much from Beverly and Leon and others. And like you said, Beverly, listening is something else. You may find me quoting you with your permission. I don't want to plagiarize, but you drop so many jewels, I'm gonna have to quote you.
That's okay, because I probably got it from somebody else. What I always say is what I know about what I know started in a room in St. Louis, Missouri, when I first came on board as the Kentucky Commission on Human Rights Executive Director. And I talked to people in St. Louis. I talked to a guy by the name of Homer Floyd in Pennsylvania. I talked to a guy by the name of Bill Hale in Texas. I talked to Paula Haley and others. People have shared freely with me throughout my career. And if we build on what it's done, and then I talked to a guy who's in Congress, we all know him, Jim Clyburn, Congressman Clyburn, who is now, he's always had this, he's willing to share, and Jim knows this and others. And then Jim Stowe, who has been a friend of mine all of this time. And it's this kind of friendship and this kind of sharing that really can build this organization and build a framework that it can be unstoppable.
Listen, that is a good way to conclude this segment, Mr. President. I think well said by both of our colleagues. So